The city pulsed with life, a living entity of endless motion. A symphony of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversations filled the streets. People wove through the sidewalks, their faces set in determined expressions, lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the small details of their surroundings. The rhythm of daily life carried them forward, pushing them past everything deemed unimportant. On a corner, near a cafe where the scent of fresh bread and coffee spilled onto the pavement, a man sat hunched against the cold brick wall. A tattered coat, it seems frayed with time, wrapped around his thin frame, an inadequate shield against the biting wind. His hands, rough and weathered, clutched a cardboard sign. The faded ink, smudged from wear, carried a simple plea, hungry. Anything helps. His face bore the map of his struggles, creases of hardship etched deeply into his skin, a beard speckled with gray, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The pedestrians glanced at him briefly, then looked away, their gazes flickering elsewhere as if acknowledging him would be an inconvenience. Some tightened their grips on their bags, others quickened their steps. The man remained motionless, his head slightly bowed, as if he had long since learned to accept this quiet rejection. Across the street, unnoticed amid the blur of rushing figures, Johnny Depp walked with an unhurried pace. The city had always fascinated him, the way it never paused, how it constantly evolved, never waiting for anyone. He pulled his coat tighter, the wind tugging at the edges, and adjusted the worn fedora that had become his companion over the years. His thoughts drifted as they often did in crowds, sifting through the fragments of his own past, until something unusual broke through the haze of movement, a stillness in the middle of all the motion. His gaze landed on the man. Unlike the others who passed by without a second glance, Johnny stopped. For a moment, he simply observed. The way the man sat, shoulders slightly curled inward as if shielding himself from the world. The way his hands gripped the sign, not in desperation, but in quiet resignation. His eyes, though lowered, held a weight heavier than exhaustion. A weight Johnny recognized. He reached into his pocket, feeling the smooth edges of folded bills, then exhaled lightly as he stepped forward. The man didn't look up right away, but Johnny didn't expect him to. He knelt down, lowering himself to the man's level, offering a presence rather than just charity. There was no rush, no need for words just yet. The city continued around them, but in that moment, they existed in a pocket of stillness. The man's eyes lifted, hesitant and guarded, meeting Johnny's. A silent conversation passed between them, one of understanding, one of recognition. Johnny extended the money toward him, but there was something more in the gesture than just an offer of help. There was patience. There was kindness. There was an invitation for something deeper. The man hesitated before taking it. His fingers, rough from years of hardship, brushed against Johnny's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of being seen. The man's fingers lingered over the folded bills for a moment before curling around them with a quiet acceptance. His grip was firm, yet uncertain, as though the weight of taking something freely given was heavier than the paper itself. His eyes flickered downward again, as if shielding himself from the complex emotions simmering beneath the surface, relief, shame, gratitude, and something unspoken, something that had long since settled in his bones. Johnny remained still, his gaze unwavering, the cash still resting in the man's grip. But there was no urgency in his posture, no rush to rise and continue on his way. The moment stretched, and then, in a quiet shift, Johnny gestured toward the cafe across the street. The offer was simple, but its meaning was more profound than a few bills in a stranger's hands. A meal, a conversation, something more human than just an exchange of money. The man hesitated, his lips parting slightly as though words were forming but couldn't quite push past the weight in his throat. His eyes flickered toward the entrance of the cafe, the golden glow spilling through its large windows, illuminating the warmth within. The thought of stepping inside seemed foreign, almost intrusive, as if crossing that threshold meant confronting the version of himself that had once belonged in such places. A beat passed. Then another. Finally, He gave the slightest nod, a movement so small it could have been missed entirely. It wasn't eagerness, nor was it rejection, it was simply the closest thing to agreement he could offer. Johnny, respecting the quiet battle being fought within the man, rose first, offering neither assistance nor pressure. He simply started walking, glancing back just once to ensure that the man followed. And he did. The scent of coffee and fresh bread enveloped them as they stepped inside, a stark contrast to the cold air left behind. The din of quiet conversations, the occasional clatter of cups against saucers, the soft hum of a city that existed within these walls, all of it formed a backdrop that was both familiar and distant to the man. He kept his shoulders slightly hunched as though shrinking himself, his hands unconsciously brushing over his worn coat as if trying to make himself presentable. Johnny led the way to a booth in the farthest corner, away from the curious glances of the other patrons. Not that many paid attention, people were often too consumed by their own worlds to notice much beyond them. Even so, the man settled into the seat cautiously, his body language betraying a quiet discomfort, the kind that came from being in a place that once felt like home but had since become foreign. A steaming plate arrived in front of him sooner than expected. The rich aroma, the vibrant colors, the simple warmth radiating from the dish, it all seemed too surreal. He stared at it for a moment too long, as if waiting for permission to indulge in something that hadn't felt like his to claim in a long time. His fingers twitched slightly before picking up the fork, his movements measured, almost reverent. The first bite was small, almost hesitant. The second came quicker. By the third, the instinct of hunger overpowered any lingering hesitations. The meal disappeared in steady motions, not rushed, but efficient, like someone who had learned to eat while the opportunity lasted. Across the table, Johnny remained relaxed, offering no commentary on the way the man ate, nor the unguarded relief that passed over his face with each bite. Instead, he simply allowed the moment to exist, waiting until the air between them settled before gently shifting the weight of their silent exchange. There was no demand for details, no prying force behind the questions that followed, just the quiet presence of someone who genuinely wanted to listen. The man recognized this difference immediately. He had met plenty who had asked about his story before, but they had done so with a detached curiosity, as if collecting tragedies like artifacts to marvel at before walking away untouched. But Johnny wasn't one of them. And so, between slow bites and the occasional pause to gather thoughts that had been left scattered for years, the man began to speak. The words came cautiously at first, woven in with uncertainty and fragmented memories. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of years unspoken. He spoke of the life before, the version of himself that had existed in another time, another reality. He had once had a job, a home, a routine that felt ordinary yet stable. But stability, he had learned, was an illusion that could crumble in an instant. The fall had begun subtly, a series of misfortunes that, on their own, seemed like minor setbacks. A lost job. A late payment. A broken relationship. The slow unraveling of things that had once felt secure. But life had a way of compounding small misfortunes into something inescapable, and before he knew it, the foundation beneath him had completely disappeared. One moment, he was a man with a future. The next, he was a statistic. He didn't dwell on the specifics, there were too many, and recounting them all felt like reliving a nightmare he had long since stopped fighting. Instead, he focused on the after, the part where survival became his only identity. The part where he learned the unspoken rules of the streets, where dignity had to be rationed carefully, where being seen was both a curse and a necessity. And yet, as he spoke, there was no bitterness in his tone. No anger, no demand for sympathy. Just a quiet acceptance of a reality that had been forced upon him. Johnny listened, his expression unreadable but his focus unwavering. He absorbed each word, allowing them the space they deserved, never once interrupting or rushing the story along. It was a rare thing, the kind of listening that wasn't waiting for its turn to speak but simply existed for the sake of understanding. The man noticed this. And perhaps that was why, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to speak without the weight of expectation pressing down on him. The plate before him had been cleared by the time the story began to slow, the words tapering off into quiet contemplation. The weight in his chest felt a fraction lighter, though he wouldn't have been able to explain why. Maybe it was the food. Maybe it was the warmth of the cafe. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because, for the first time in years, he wasn't just another invisible figure blending into the background of a moving city. For the first time, he was seen. The last crumbs of his meal had been wiped from the plate, but Thomas remained seated, his hands resting loosely around the empty cup in front of him. The cafe hummed around them, conversations rising and falling, the clinking of dishes blending with the soft notes of a jazz song drifting from the overhead speakers. The warmth of the space contrasted with the cold reality waiting just outside its doors, a reality Thomas had learned to survive within. For a long moment, he simply sat there, his gaze distant, lost in the echoes of a life that felt like a ghost of something once real. The weight of Johnny's silent patience sat beside him, not intrusive, not expectant, just present. And somehow, that made all the difference. The words came slowly, as if unearthing something buried too long beneath layers of silence. Once, before the streets had swallowed him whole, Thomas had been a musician. Not famous, not wealthy, but good. Good enough that people had listened, good enough that the dream had once felt within reach. His fingers had known the frets of a guitar the way they now knew the roughness of concrete. His voice had once filled rooms with melody, the way the wind now filled the spaces where walls should have been. He spoke of the days when music had been his life, late nights in dimly lit bars, his songs floating through rooms filled with strangers who became believers, if only for a moment. He had been on the edge of something greater, a record deal nearly sealed, a future mapped out in melodies and lyrics scrawled in notebooks now long lost. Music had been his pulse, his purpose. And then, as easily as a single chord breaking a melody, it had all unraveled. The details were hard to recount, not because he had forgotten them, but because they had etched themselves too deeply into his bones. The fall hadn't been a single moment but a series of cracks that widened over time, each one pushing him further into the void. It started with trust, misplaced, shattered. A friend, a partner, someone he had built his dreams alongside, had taken more than just money. He had taken opportunities, stolen songs, and walked away with a future that wasn't his to claim. The betrayal had been swift and complete, leaving Thomas scrambling in the wake of something he couldn't stop. Then came the spiral, the weight of loss pressing too heavily against his ribs. He had turned to the only thing that numbed it, a substance that promised temporary relief but demanded everything in return. At first, it was just a crutch, just a way to get through the worst of it. Then it became a habit, then a need, then a prison. Addiction stole the remnants of what had been left. Gigs dried up. Calls went unanswered. Promises were broken, not just by others, but by himself. He lost his home, then his family's trust, then the last pieces of himself that still believed he could claw his way back. By the time he realized he was drowning, he had already sunk too deep. The streets became both punishment and sanctuary. Days bled into nights, weeks into months, time losing its shape as survival became the only rhythm he knew. He learned to navigate a world where being invisible was safer than being seen, where hunger was a constant companion, and where kindness was a rarity, often carrying strings he couldn't afford to pull. Through it all, the music had remained in the back of his mind, an ache rather than a comfort. His fingers still twitched with the memory of chords, but they had forgotten the feel of strings. His voice had grown quieter, buried beneath exhaustion and regret. And yet, despite everything, a part of him had never let go of the sound that had once defined him. It haunted him in the quiet moments, in the spaces between survival. It was there when he watched the city move around him, when he sat on street corners and listened to buskers play melodies that felt like ghosts of a past life. Johnny listened without interruption, without shifting uncomfortably in his seat, without offering the empty reassurances Thomas had learned to recognize as nothing more than words. There was something in Johnny's silence that felt different, not just sympathy, but something deeper. Maybe it was because Johnny knew something of loss himself. Maybe it was because he understood what it meant to hold on to a dream even when the world had tried to strip it away. Or maybe, it was simply because, for the first time in a long while, Thomas wasn't telling his story to someone who pitied him, but to someone who saw him. By the time his voice faded, the weight of his past settling between them, the cafe had thinned out. The air between them was heavy, not with judgment, but with understanding. Thomas exhaled, his fingers tightening around the cup before slowly releasing it. For years, he had carried his story like a burden, something too heavy to share, too tangled in shame to speak aloud. But here, now, in the quiet presence of a man who had no reason to care, he had let it spill into the open. And somehow, that alone felt like the first step toward something different. The cafe had long since quieted, the hum of conversation replaced by the occasional clatter of dishes being cleared away. Thomas sat across from Johnny, his story laid bare, his past woven into the air between them like a lingering note from a song left unfinished. There was no expectation in his expression, no trace of hopefulness, only the quiet acceptance of a life that had unraveled too many times to be stitched back together. But Johnny saw something else. Beneath the exhaustion, beneath the years of hardship and loss, there was a flicker of something that hadn't been entirely extinguished. A man who had once stood on the precipice of a dream. A musician who had lost his way but had never truly lost his music. There was an unshakable resilience in Thomas, one that had carried him through the darkest nights, one that had allowed him to sit here now, recounting his story without breaking apart beneath the weight of it. And that resilience deserved more than just a meal and a kind ear. Johnny reached for his phone. The first step was stability. The streets had hardened Thomas, forced him into survival mode for so long that the idea of rest, of safety, seemed almost foreign. That needed to change. He dialed a number, one he hadn't used in a while but had always kept stored for reasons just like this. A friend, someone who had built a place for those who had fallen, those who had wandered too far from themselves and needed a way back. The conversation was brief, but the result was immediate. A bed. A warm space. A chance. No requirements beyond the willingness to take it. No strings except the belief that it wasn't too late. Next came the things that Thomas wouldn't think to ask for. The things that seemed trivial to someone who had gone without for so long but were necessary in helping him feel human again. A trip to a store, where clothes weren't chosen for survival but for comfort, for dignity. Shoes that didn't carry the weight of miles walked with nowhere to go. A jacket that didn't belong to another life long abandoned. Each item was met with quiet hesitation, as if Thomas expected someone to pull them away at any moment, as if he were trespassing in a world he no longer belonged to. But there was no rejection this time, no doors shutting in his face. He was given choices, simple as they were, and in choosing, he reclaimed a piece of himself. But it wasn't enough to just give him a place to rest. Johnny knew that. Shelter would keep him safe, but it wouldn't heal what had been broken. Thomas's story had been one of loss, but also of music, a passion buried beneath years of hardship, but still alive, still waiting to be found. Johnny had seen too many people let go of what made them who they were, had watched as life eroded their dreams until nothing remained but regret. He wasn't about to let Thomas become another one of those stories. Another call, this time to a studio. A small place, nothing extravagant, but filled with people who understood what it meant to create. They had heard the name before, not as a star, but as a musician who had once shown promise, a name that had nearly made it before it disappeared into the noise of the industry. There was no hesitation on the other end of the call. A space was open. A chance to play again, to step back into the world he had lost. When Johnny told Thomas about it, there was no immediate reaction. He sat motionless, the weight of everything sinking in. Disbelief flickered in his eyes, the kind that came from too many disappointments, too many moments of thinking things might change only to watch them slip away. It was too much, too sudden. And yet, for the first time in years, there was something else mixed into the hesitation. A quiet, fragile hope. The next steps weren't easy. Walking through the doors of the rehab center, accepting the bed, allowing himself to be cared for, each of these things felt unnatural after years of isolation. There were days where the weight of his past threatened to pull him back under, when the idea of rebuilding felt more exhausting than simply continuing as he had. But then came the music. The first time Thomas set foot in the studio, he had hesitated at the threshold, fingers twitching at his sides as if they could still feel the phantom strings of a guitar long lost. The room smelled of old wood and amplifiers, the kind of space where sound lived and breathed. A familiar world, yet one he hadn't dared step into in years. Then, the moment that changed everything. A guitar, offered, not forced into his hands. The weight of it settled against his body, familiar and foreign all at once. His fingers pressed against the strings, hesitant, uncertain. The first note was quiet, unsure. The second was stronger. And then, without realizing it, he was playing. The studio remained silent except for the music. The years had not stolen his talent. Rust had settled in, but beneath it was something raw, something real. Something worth saving. And as he played, Thomas felt something shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. The bar was small, nestled between a bookstore and a laundromat, the kind of place that felt intimate the moment one stepped inside. The air was warm, thick with the scent of old wood and a faint trace of spilled whiskey. A handful of patrons sat at round tables, their conversations hushed as they leaned in to listen, drawn in by the quiet magic of live music. On a modest stage beneath the dim glow of overhead bulbs, Thomas played. His fingers moved with confidence over the strings of his guitar, no longer hesitant, no longer weighed down by uncertainty. Each note carried a part of him, a reflection of the journey he had walked, the pain, the loss, the resilience. His voice, once silenced by hardship, now soared, rich and steady. The audience, though small, was captivated. Some swayed gently, others sat in still reverence, letting the music settle into their bones. Thomas had played before, years ago, when he had been someone else. But this was different. This wasn't just performance, it was a reclamation. A return to the self he had lost, not in the way he once imagined, but in a way that felt truer. There was no promise of fame, no grand comeback story. There was simply music, and the knowledge that he had made it back to where he was always meant to be. Among the quiet listeners, a familiar figure sat at the back of the room, watching. Johnny had heard about the gig through a mutual friend, one of the studio guys who had seen Thomas slowly piece himself back together, day by day, note by note. There had been no hesitation in coming. He had no expectations, no need for recognition. He had only wanted to see for himself what had become of the man he had met months ago on a cold city street, wrapped in a coat too thin for the season, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. That man was gone. In his place was someone steady, someone present. A man who had found his way back through strings and melodies, through patience and persistence. A man who had taken the second chance offered to him and turned it into something real. The song ended, the final chord lingering in the air before dissolving into quiet applause. Thomas lifted his gaze, nodding in appreciation to the crowd. His eyes scanned the room, casual at first, until they landed on the familiar figure in the corner. Recognition flickered. For a moment, he simply stared, as if trying to convince himself that the image before him was real. Then something shifted, a slow smile, the kind that carried gratitude too deep for words. Johnny returned it with a nod, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. There was nothing to say. Nothing that needed to be said. Minutes later, as the bar settled back into its usual rhythm, Johnny slipped away, stepping out into the cool night air. The city stretched before him, its lights reflecting off damp pavement, the hum of life carrying on as it always did. He pulled his coat tighter, adjusting his hat as he began to walk, his pace unhurried. This wasn't the kind of story that would make headlines. There would be no grand retelling, no viral video capturing the moment. But that wasn't the point. The point was that one small act, one moment of kindness, one decision to stop instead of walk past, had set off a chain reaction. A meal had led to a conversation. A conversation had led to a chance. And a chance had led to something far greater than either of them could have predicted. Johnny didn't need thanks. He didn't need acknowledgement. As he disappeared into the rhythm of the city, he carried with him the quiet certainty that he had made a difference. And sometimes, that was enough.